What goes into the mental transition after the NBA draft? I speak about this with ESPN basketball analyst Jay Bilas in this episode of Iggy's Sports Talk.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hold up. Wait until the whole team show up. Yeah.
Welcome
I ain't
back
never even
into
came
Iggy's
close.
Sports Talk. I am your host, Jakey Nazuski, your Iggy for short, and I want to thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If this is your first time listening or watching Iggy's Sports Talk. In this podcast, I focus on connecting sports with mental health and really shedding light on the deeper aspects of not only sports, but also life. My goal with each and every single episode is to help you sort of shift your perspective from only focusing on the surface level aspects of sports and sort of looking at the mental side as well. And in this episode, I had the opportunity to do just that when talking about the NBA draft, which is just one day away. And I had the opportunity to speak with ESPN basketball analyst Jay Bilas on how athletes and NBA prospects don't allow the pressure to get to them when transitioning to the NBA, while also what goes into the mental side of transitioning from college or from international leagues and how to make that process as smooth as possible. And we all know that process isn't easy, especially when the media or fans are promoting you as a player who could change the entire trajectory of a franchise and an organization. We know how that pressure can get to some guys. We saw that with Greg Oden. We saw that, with Anthony Bennett. And I feel like a lot of things have really changed in terms of the NBA draft process and how franchises are really being able to help some of these athletes be able to transition as smoothly as possible. And I think that mental side is really important as well, because some of these guys, 18, 19 years old, really going from, being looked at as this insane prospect that everybody is putting on a pedestal and emulating and saying how great you are, to when you are really put on an NBA stage with all these other high level professionals who have already gone through that process, who already have made a name for themselves. And you're a young player who all these fans and all these analysts and the people who love and watch the NBA, they're expecting you to be this guy who was as dominant, in high school and college. And it's not easy for some of these younger athletes to be able to make that transition as easy as possible. We've seen some guys struggle with their weight. We've seen some guys, struggle with addiction, substance abuse. And I feel like a little bit more with how mental health has been shed on much more in the last few years. I feel like, especially with sports psychologists being lot more prevalent and having a bigger role now in organizations, I feel like it's a little bit easier of a transition. But this is still something that I'm super curious how somebody like Jay really looks at it, and how he's really observed, franchises changing the way that they go about making that transition as smooth as possible. And, I feel like, as well as, people who observe and watch, the NBA or just sports in general, I've sort of tried to change my viewpoint as a fan of not really taking a small sample size and exaggerating or overreacting on how, a player has, been able to perform in a small amount of time. It's so easy, especially after a player gets drafted and, within the first month or two, if they're not living up to those expectations that a lot of people had in their mind, it's easy to overreact and it's easy to paint a picture, especially for media members, for fans, that this guy isn't what he was supposed to be. And especially for guys who are so young coming out of college, being able to not allow that to deter their play on the court or for them to, get down on themselves is super tough, I can imagine. I've never been obviously an NBA prospect or had the pressure like this, but I feel like as fans, it's really important that we give some of these prospects a little bit of time to show who they are and show what they can do in this league, and not be so immediate with our reactions. And, even if a guy doesn't live up to those immediate expectations, it's so easy and simple to just bash the player, bash the person. But that aspect of it, I think, is so important. Remembering that they are people, remembering that some of these kids, some of them are 20, 21, and yes, they're putting themselves in this position to be in the limelight, to be in the spotlight. And that's what comes with the job. But at the same time, I think it's really vital as well as, people who pay and invest money to watch these sports or to, you know, uh, have a fandom for a team. It's easy to bash a player, but I think it's important to separate, the player from the person. And, if a guy's not performing well, say it how it is, but at the same time, don't always bash the person, because I think that's so simple. But I think that's a great way to transition. So without further ado, my conversation with Jay Bilas.
I'm curious how the transition from college to the NBA mentally can really affect a prospect and being successful in the league, and maybe how some teams have evolved their process to make it more of a smoother transition for some of those athletes or NBA prospects.
That's a good question. I think most teams, if not all teams, are much more savvy now about drafting young players in their transition to the NBA. It used to be you brought in a 22-year-old oftentimes that had been 4 years in college for the transition, and even though they were called rookies and had a lot to learn, now you're bringing an 18, 19-year-old in. So there's a lot more, and I don't mean this to sound pejorative, but a lot more hand-holding that needs to go on, and because the players are younger. But so many of them have proven capable of handling the transition, but it's certainly difficult. And you're dealing with the best players in the world that are mature men, and so there's a learning curve that goes on. But at least in the last couple of years, players now, at least in college, and to an extent, the G League Ignite, have been dealing with money, and so they're a little savvier than perhaps they were in years past. And the players at age 19 have a heck of a lot more experience now than they did in years past. But it's still a significant jump into the real basketball world, I would say.
If I could just follow up real fast, how about like the international transition, especially with the success that we've seen from Luka. How are teams, specifically the Spurs, planning on potentially learning from what others have done from international prospects perspective?
Yeah, I think generally international prospects have a little bit more maturity, and again, that's generally, it's not true of everyone. But they're playing professionally before they get into the draft process, and have been raised more so as pros, and they're playing against older players. So there's probably more of an opportunity to mature faster once they get to draft age, and for an international prospect, it's 18 years old. So I don't know that you'd want to say it's easier, because international prospects are dealing with coming over to a new country and things like that. But they played high level basketball, most of them, if not all, for a period of years before they get into the draft. So they may have a little bit of a leg up earlier because of that level of competition and the maturity of the players they're playing against. They're playing against men at an earlier age.
One last thing that I have for you, Jay, is we've seen some recent examples, with Zion Williamson, DeAndre Ayton, so some of the pressure of the #1 overall pick getting to some of those prospects. And so I'm curious, from your viewpoint, over the years, how has some of these players or teams found ways easier so then the pressure doesn't get so much to them? They feel like they don't have to save a franchise just through this one pick or through this one player.
I don't know what anybody can do about that. It's like being the favorite in a golf tournament or anything else. You still have to play. And, a lot of these players have been highly ranked out of high school and had to prove it in college and all this other stuff. It's just part of the deal. And, I think you have to satisfy yourself as best you can that the player can handle that. But I don't know that you pass up on a player like DeAndre Ayton and say, well, let somebody else take him at 2. We'll look for somebody who can handle #1. If you think he's the best player, you take him. Now, if you have concern that he can't handle, because it's not like there's no pressure on the 2nd or 3rd pick in the draft. The way I look at it is guys can either play at that level or they can't. But DeAndre Ayton's had an outstanding career. I think he's lived up to every bit to number one status, just because, maybe Luka Doncic, Luka Doncic has been great as well. Doesn't mean that somehow DeAndre Ayton didn't perform at a high level. And Zion Williams has been hurt. When he's been on the floor, his numbers are absurd. I don't know exactly how to process that, but I'm not as worried about players being able to handle it as much as are they the best player.
I hope that you did enjoy my conversation with Jay Bilas and got a little bit more insight on how organizations really help these NBA prospects transition smoothly, from college or international leagues to the NBA, but focusing on the mental side, because that's one thing that I think a lot of people don't think about, sort of like I spoke about before we started the interview. That's one of the biggest reasons why I host this podcast and I post episodes just like this one, to really be able to help fans see that different perspective and look more at the mental side as well, because that's something that I think not a lot of people think about really at all. And I love how it's a lot more prevalent now and spoken more about, but that's one thing that I think is really overshadowed. We need to speak about it more. The more awareness that there is about mental health, not only in sports, but also in society, makes people feel like they're not going crazy. We're having some of these struggles, and it's okay to not be okay. And I think that's something really important to not only focus on just in life, but also when you're an athlete or when you're watching sports. And so if you want to stay more up to date with episodes just like this one on Iggy's Sports Talk, you can subscribe over on YouTube for the video versions, or if you like listening to the audio versions, I post episodes on whatever audio platform that you listen to, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, pretty much all of them that you can think of. And then I also post clips and other updates regarding the podcast over on Instagram. If you want to follow it over there, it's at Jake Iggy. But I greatly appreciate everybody tuning in. As always, I hope that you found some value from this episode. That's my goal each and every single time. I go behind this mic and I post an episode for this podcast, but I greatly appreciate everybody tuning in. I hope that you have a great rest of your day. I'll see you and talk to you next time. Peace.